When my son looked me in the eye and said, "You will not be part of Christmas this year," I laughed out loud, stood up, took my coat, and made a phone call that would change more than one household. In less than 4 weeks, the automatic mortgage payment that had left my account every month for the last 6 years stopped his bank. And that was only the beginning. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because if you have ever been used and then dismissed by your own blood, you know this is not just my story. The living room smelled like cinnamon and cheap pine from the artificial tree. The couch fabric felt worn under my hands, and the chandelier's bulbs gave off a warm halo that framed my son like a portrait. He avoided my gaze. He had the ring on his finger catching the light. He folded his arms. He said, "I am sorry, but you are not welcome here for Christmas." And he said it with the kind of finality reserved for court sentences. The words struck me like a stone. My palms went clammy. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that used to come when the mortgage statement arrived each month. I thought of every check I had signed, every transfer I had set up, because that house had been the shelter for my family during hard winters. I left the room, went to my car, and made a call to the bank that would teach them all a lesson in values and in numbers. You will hear how a canceled transfer became a headline, how receipts and extratos turned into evidence, and how, in the end, I found a strange kind of peace. The day before that dinner had been ordinary. The street smelled of wet asphalt and roasted chestnuts from a vendor at the corner. My son Michael had texted me a short emoticon, and my daughter-in-law Sarah had made a point of asking me to bring the cranberry sauce I always made, because she liked it. I had driven the same route I had driven for years, past Angela's bakery with its glass windows fogged by steam, past the school where I had taught on Wednesdays, and finally to the house with the lighted wreath. When I walked in, the house looked perfect. The silverware shimmered, the tablecloth was iron tight, there were framed photos on the mantel showing years of birthdays and graduations where I was smaller and younger and smiling at their achievements. I hung my coat and felt the weight of the winter in my shoulders. The smell of roasted meat and butter filled my nostrils. I heard laughter coming from the dining room, muffled but celebratory. Then it happened. Michael stood up and said those words. I remember exactly how the china sounded when someone set a plate down too hard. I remember Sarah's fingers worrying a napkin, the ticking of the wall clock, the low hum of a song leaking from the speaker. He said, "We decided as a family, you will not be part of Christmas." He kept his voice even, as if he was reading from minutes at a meeting. I said, "Michael, what are you talking about?" He said, "It is better this way." I said, "Why?" He said, "You know why." I said, "I paid this house for years." He said, "You gave us the money. That does not mean you control the day." I said, "I thought family meant more than that." He said, "We are done talking." The conversation went on for nearly 15 minutes, with interruptions, with Sarah stepping in and out trying to mediate, with Mark, my lawyer cousin, whispering a suggestion about boundaries, and with my sister Linda trying to keep the peace. Every line of dialogue was a thin blade cutting into the same old wound. At one point, Angela came to the doorway and said quietly, "Do you want me to bring your coat?" My hands were shaking, and I tasted metallic salt on the edge of panic. That sense of being cut off, of being moved from the center to the periphery, was a physical ache. I had a history they did not see. I had grown up in a house where the radio was often the only heat until my father fixed the stove. As a child, I learned to count pennies and to mend shoes. That part of my life made me precise with money and generous with time. The sacrifices I made later came from a place of loyalty and promise. After my wife, Maria, got sick, I refinanced our house to help with medical bills. I balanced hospital fees, paid extra on the principal when I could, and rearranged transfers so that my children would not suffer. The backstory is long and it matters. When Michael was 21 and could not keep a job, I co-signed loans, I wrote checks, I set up automatic transfers from my account to cover his mortgage payments. First a $350 transfer, then gradually increasing to $815 a month as renovations and bills rose. I have the estratos, the comprobantes, each withdrawal dated on the 10th of every month for the last 6 years. I saved receipts and wrote them in a ledger. I gave up my winter vacations. I learned to live within a smaller standard so they could have a bigger one. The ledger shows payments from January 2019 to November 2024, totaling $35,760. Those numbers are not just ink on a page. They are nights without heat, lunches skipped, and a roof over their heads. The ledger was my confession and my proof. 3 small paragraphs from the past anchor what I would do. Next. Childhood taught me resilience. Sacrifice taught me the arithmetic of love. The present situation taught me that affection can be transactional and that sometimes the person you help feels entitled to erase you. After the backstory, I paused and spoke directly. If you have ever been used or dismissed by someone you loved, you are not alone. Tell me in the comments what the worst humiliation from your own family has been. Start your comment with "I saw" and then what happened, because sharing helps other people feel less isolated, and it helps me choose future stories to tell. The community around this channel has become a small refuge where practical advice and empathy grow. Your comment might help someone decide to stand up for themselves or to seek legal counsel. Now I will tell you what I decided that night and why I made the choice I made. I went to the bank and asked to suspend the automatic transfer. The room smelled faintly of copier toner and lemon cleaner. The bank branch manager, Tom, met me at the counter, his tie slightly askew, and asked for my ID. I explained calmly, I need to cancel a scheduled outgoing transfer to another account. Tom asked if it was a mistake. I said no. He asked for the account numbers, asked for the authorization codes. I handed over the paperwork I had prepared, the old transfer forms, the ledger, and a letter I wrote outlining the circumstances. I heard the printer in back, the soft shuffle of other clients, the clink of coins in a jar, and the quiet breath of people unaware of what was about to unfold. The procedure took a few minutes. Tom put me on hold twice and returned saying he needed verbal authorization and a confirmation from me on record. I gave it. I felt my shoulders relax. The bank confirmed the cancellation and told me that the next automatic debit scheduled for the 10th would not process. I hung up with a strange mixture of relief and guilt. I thought about calling them to explain, about apologizing, but I knew that the apology would only be a ticket back to dependency. They noticed right away. Michael called, then texted, then sent a message on social media. He asked, "Where is the money?" I texted back, "I canceled it." He called, he shouted, he said, "You cannot do this to us." I answered, "You told me I was not welcome." He said, "You are being dramatic." I said, "I am being precise." Sarah texted a flurry of angry emojis and then a message that read, "You always make everything about you." I replied, "No, I made a decision." Mark, the cousin who tended to their side, called and said, "This is going to be a mess." Linda tried to call me and said, "Maybe call them and make up." I said, "Maybe you should ask yourself why I would do this." The calls piled up. The neighbor Angela left a note on my door saying, "For God's sake, sort this out." Jorge, a reporter from the local paper who knew me from the old PTA meetings, called to ask if there was a story. The provocations were many. They sent emails to the bank asking what had happened. They posted on social media accusing me of being cruel, posting screenshots of my private messages out of context and painting me as the villain. The humiliation moved from dining room to phone screen, from private hurt to public gossip. That public exposure became the spark for a strategy. I read the article in the regional paper where Jorge had printed a version of their side. The headline framed me as an older man who withheld support. I felt my face flush as neighbors stopped by to ask what had happened. The smell of rain that afternoon contrasted with the heat in my neck. I decided to collect proof. I sat at my kitchen table under a lamp with a cup of tea cooling at my side, a pen and a stack of bank statements. I made photocopies, I sorted transfers by date, I printed out messages and highlighted the ones where Michael demanded money or thanked me for bailouts. I asked Emily, my granddaughter, to help me scan documents. I called Mark, the lawyer, and said, I want to prepare. Mark told me the basics, told me which documents to copy, listed the names of witnesses who could attest that I had paid the transfers, and gave me the number of a reliable accountant he recommended, a woman named Priya who could verify bank reconciliations. Priya confirmed that with my statements, we could show a clear trail of transfers, dates, and amounts. In a neat stack, I had the evidence: bank extratos, comprovantes, texts, receipts for home improvements that I had paid for and that they had benefited from, and notes from neighbors who remembered times I had delivered meals. I could feel my resolve harden. There was a strange satisfaction in seeing numbers line up like soldiers. One of the key moments of tension came when Michael arranged a family meeting in the town hall with relatives and friends present and framed me as unreasonable. I arrived late because I had been at the accountant's office. The hall smelled of gym polish and coffee. The fluorescent lights made everyone's skin look washed out. People took sides. I sat for a while, listening, the carpet scratchy under my shoes. Michael stood and made a speech about boundaries, about independence, about how they did not need my interference. He used the kind of rhetoric common to new money and new pride. Someone in the audience, Linda's friend Carla, said, "Hush," and touched his sleeve. I stood up slowly and asked for a chance to speak. The conversation that followed ran through a dozen exchanges. I began, "I have proof of every transfer." He interrupted, "We do not need proof. We have our feelings." I replied, "Feelings do not pay a mortgage." He said, "You are trying to punish us." I said, "I feel punished every time I am used." He said, "There are other ways." I said, "Other ways would have involved a conversation before you closed the door." He said, "You are not going to make this public." I said, "If the truth is only private, the pattern continues." The back and forth lasted nearly 20 minutes. The audience reacted audibly, murmurs, and the scrape of chairs. That debate reached a flashpoint when Jorge, who had come to cover the meeting, asked a pointed question about the ledger. I felt the heat of the room shift. The montage of evidence and the careful planning produced an initial retribution that was strategic rather than vindictive. I placed packets on the dining room table at a Christmas gathering they had scheduled later that month. Each packet contained photocopies of bank statements, highlighted transfers, and a short letter explaining why the transfer had been canceled and what I had done. I arrived early, carrying the packets in a plain brown folder. The house smelled like orange peel and wax. I set the folder down in the center of the table where the turkey should have been and waited. Conversations paused. Sarah looked at me and asked in a low voice, "Are you serious?" I said, "Open the folder." Michael took a packet. His hands hesitated as if they expected it to explode. He read the first line, and his face went from anger to stunned silence. Guests who had been talking fell quiet. There were murmurs. Mark tried to take control, but it was already unfolding. I did not shout or slam doors. I handed a packet to Jorge and asked him to read aloud a few lines into his phone while recording. He did, his voice steady. The room absorbed the facts. The packets had everything: dates, total amounts, and a straightforward explanation of why I had stopped the transfers. There were also copies of the social posts they had made and the screenshots taken out of context. Watching them read was a peculiar sensation. It mixed vindication with loss. I watched Sarah whisper for the first time since that night. Michael's hands trembled, and Linda covered her mouth. The scene had the quality of a verdict. There were legal and technical steps I followed to avoid liability. I consulted with Mark and Priya. We drafted a formal notice of change of payment and a letter explaining the canceled transfer as a decision I had the right to make on my personal accounts. The bank recorded the cancellation at 11:17 on a Wednesday. The protocol for the bank involved a hold period for automatic transfer changes of 5 business days. I asked Tom at the bank to confirm the cancellation in writing and to provide a reference number, which he did. I paid a small fee for certified copies at the clerk's office, filed them, and kept everything double archived. That procedural description was short but precise because accuracy matters. The bank provided an email confirmation with a reference code and the date and timestamp. Priya, the accountant, prepared a reconciliation report showing inflows and outflows and stating unequivocally that the transfers had originated from my account. There were several high-tension moments after the packet distribution. One came when Michael threatened to go to the police alleging harassment. I received a text from him that read, "If you do not stop this, I will involve authorities." I replied, "Bring them. I am ready to show everything." He called my bluff. A police officer named Sergeant Morales came to speak with me at my house 2 days later. The house smelled of lemon cleaning solution. The officer was kind but formal. He asked if I felt threatened. I said no. He reviewed the documents and said it was a civil matter. He left a card and recommended mediation. Another tense moment was when a community fundraiser that I had traditionally supported announced on social media that they were pausing donations while they investigated the family dispute. I felt the sting of public withdrawal, but also a swell of private support. Angela from the bakery left me a loaf of bread and a note saying, "We stand by you." Priya called and said the numbers were clear. Jorge wrote a follow-up article, but this time included the ledger and invited me for an interview. Watching the narrative shift from accusation to documentation was a lesson in how evidence functions in public opinion. The confrontation that became the climax happened at the community center during a potluck that doubled as a holiday reconciliation attempt. The hall smelled of stew and scented candles. It was filled with familiar faces from church, the PTA, and the neighborhood watch. Michael had arranged for an audience of supporters. I walked in carrying a small stack of properly bound packets. I stood at the microphone and spoke calmly. I said, "This is what I did and why." He interrupted from the front row, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You are making a circus." I replied, "I am making the facts visible." The dialogue that followed was extended and sharp. He said, "You humiliated us in public." I said, "You humiliated me in private first." He said, "You do not get to play judge." I said, "I do not want to be judge. I want to be heard." He said, "We do not owe you anything." I said, "You owe honesty." He said, "This is not about honesty." I said, "It is when money and dignity cross." My voice was steady. People recorded it on their phones. The packets I distributed contained chronological evidence and a simple plea. Let us learn from the ledger and change how we treat each other. The room reacted in waves. Some left in anger. Others stayed to ask questions. That public airing did not repair relationships overnight, but it changed the terms of the conversation. After the confrontation, there were consequences beyond the family. The local newspaper ran a piece that included the payment schedule I had prepared and interviews with Priya and Mark verifying the accounting. Some neighbors who had turned away earlier called to apologize. The community center director convened a small meeting to discuss mediation. Michael and Sarah faced a choice: reconcile and acknowledge the help received, or continue to frame the narrative as my cruelty. They chose to go on the defensive, posting emotional appeals online that garnered sympathy and led to a secondary wave of commentary. The bank recorded a surge of inquiries about mutual aid and voluntary transfers. I received offers of support from a small local charity that provided counseling and from a group of retired teachers who had seen similar family dynamics. Slowly, the outrage cooled, and facts did the work emotions sometimes could not. There were financial consequences too. Without the automatic payments, Michael needed to reallocate his budget and renegotiate certain bills. The mortgage company called to say a missed payment could lead to late fees or refinancing options. That concrete reality forced conversations about responsibility that previously had been avoided. Throughout the whole saga, I named and relied on people who mattered. Michael, my son, was the antagonist turned mirror. Sarah, his wife, played the role of defender and later of someone who questioned her choices. Mark, my cousin, the lawyer, offered counsel and tried to mediate. Linda, my sister, was the peacemaker who alternated between scolding and support. Angela, the neighbor, provided moral support and food. Jorge, the reporter, documented the shifts in public narrative. Priya, the accountant, verified the numbers and gave credibility. Tom, the bank manager, processed the technical steps. Emily, my granddaughter, scanned documents and sat with me in silence while we sorted receipts. Each of these people had roles and reactions that shaped how events unfolded. 1 month later, the immediate fallout looked like this. The mortgage company had sent a notice about a missed transfer and offered a grace period with a late fee of $250 if the payment was not brought current within 10 days. Michael and Sarah had cried on the phone and then come over to sit and talk in a way they had in months. We had a long conversation in my kitchen where the air smelled like coffee and the light came through frosted windows. Michael admitted he had been embarrassed about accepting help and that his pride had poisoned his judgment. Sarah apologized for how she had phrased things. We talked about setting boundaries and about how to transition to a fairer arrangement, including a repayment plan that Michael would honor without framing it as humiliation. The neighborhood reacted in small ways. Angela posted a bread recipe with a line about community help. Jorge published a second article that included both sides and a copy of the ledger. The community center set up a mediation session scheduled for the following week. The financial numbers were concrete and pragmatic. I had saved copies of the statements, and we agreed on a transfer schedule that would allow Michael to make the payments himself and avoid further late fees. The grace period was used, but the mortgage remained intact. The important change was that a conversation replaced the silence. 3 months later, there was a more public reckoning. Michael had begun to attend a financial counseling session recommended by Priya. He was learning budgeting, learning how to reconcile his own account, and how to communicate about money without turning it into a moral indictment. The local charity that had offered counseling helped coordinate 3 community workshops on intergenerational finances, where I was invited to speak about ledger keeping and honest conversations. Attendance was modest at first and then grew. Locals like Linda and Angela brought chairs and coffee. Mark helped draft simple templates for agreements between family members who share money. Social media calmed, and some posts that had been accusatory were replaced by reflections on pride and apology. A former critic, Carla, who had scolded at the town hall, reached out and offered a public statement about looking at the facts. Jorge ran a feature piece about how transparency can prevent hurt, using our story as a cautionary example. Financially, Michael had paid back half of the outstanding mistransfers and set up a small emergency fund. He seemed quieter, more measured. The community began to look at similar cases with more nuance and began offering resources rather than judgments. 6 months later, things had shifted again. The family had not fully healed, but the edges were less jagged. Michael and I had a dinner together at a small restaurant downtown that smelled of olive oil and garlic. We did not talk about the past much, but the normalcy of splitting a bill mattered in its own way. The mortgage was current. The regional paper ran a follow-up piece noting that while relationships had been strained, the municipality had adopted a small policy recommendation: community outreach to educate families about co-signed loans and the emotional complexities of intergenerational support. The charity secured a small grant of $5,000 to run workshops for a year. People I had not spoken to in months began to wave in the street. Emily visited more often. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching a simple class on budgeting for the elderly who were sometimes expected to support adult children. My sense of freedom returned in a measured way. I had not sought revenge in a vengeful sense. I had sought accountability and visibility. The lesson was both practical and moral. The ledger had not only documented money, it had documented responsibility and obligations. In the end, I lost some easy warmth, but a clearer boundary and a community conversation that might help others avoid similar wounds. If you liked this story, please subscribe and share your own experience in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from and begin with "I saw" so others can find similar stories. I will keep telling stories that hold people to account while offering paths forward. At the end of the day, I lost a seat at a decorated table, but I did not lose my dignity. I chose to stop financing a silence that cost more than money. Remember, true family respect is not bought with transfers, and freedom sometimes looks like closing an account and opening a conversation.